Suppliers, including Google, are cutting off Huawei after a recent government order. What that means for consumers around the world. Hi all, welcome to Plain English, the best podcast for learning English with current events. I'm Jeff. JR is the producer, and you are part of the best audience in the world. I really do believe that. Today is episode 159, and you can find a full transcript of today's episode at plainenglish.com/159. Coming up today, the U.S. government has placed Huawei, the Chinese cell phone manufacturer, on a trade blacklist. That means big companies like Google and chip manufacturers need permission from the U.S. government to work with Huawei. It's just one facet of the current negotiations between the U.S. and China. That's today's main topic. The expression is a phrasal verb, flare up, and we have a song from JR at the end of the episode. Before we jump in, I wanted to let you know that this is not just a one-way communication here. I love hearing from listeners, and a great way to engage with us would be via our email community. Each Monday and Thursday, I send out additional study resources totally for free to my email friends, and I love hearing from all of you. So many of you reply with your opinions on the episode topics and your own experiences, and I just love hearing that. So you can sign up for those emails at plainenglish.com/mail, M-A-I-L, and later on in the episode, I'll give you my WhatsApp number and our social media contacts. A game of political hardball between the U.S. and China got a lot more serious last week when the U.S. put Chinese telecoms giant Huawei on a trade blacklist. The measure, signed by U.S. President Donald Trump in an executive order, means that Huawei cannot buy products from American companies unless those companies have permission from the U.S. government. This is the latest chapter in two interconnected sagas. Trade negotiations between the U.S. and China is one, and the national security concerns over Huawei's 5G equipment is the other. Start with the first one. The U.S. and China have been locked in trade negotiations for about a year, ever since Trump made it a priority to adjust the terms of trade between the two countries. The negotiations have gone up, down, and sideways, but a conflict flared up recently, and the U.S. slapped additional tariffs on Chinese-made goods. China then retaliated with their own tariffs on U.S.-made goods. The tariffs were more than just symbolic, but less than a total trade breakdown between the two countries. Still, it will have some bite. An American business group surveyed companies in both China and the U.S. and asked how they would be affected by the increased tariffs on both sides. 3/4 of the respondents said they would be negatively affected. And tariffs are just fees for trading. So if two parties on either side of the Pacific Ocean were happy trading before, well, they will now have to pay more for the privilege to do so. Right around the same time as the two countries were trading barbs, Trump decided to impose the new restrictions on Huawei. The real reason for doing this was probably to turn up the heat on China as part of the trade negotiations. The stated reason, though, was national security. That's because in addition to making cell phones, Huawei makes a lot of the behind-the-scenes equipment that your cell phone carriers use to deliver your service. That is the sensitive part. Since so much is built on the backs of these networks, phone calls, business, government communications, financial information, things like that, countries have a national security interest in making sure that these networks are secure. Now, the US, Australia, and Japan have the view that Huawei cannot be trusted to build the critical technology in their countries out of suspicion that the Chinese government might use that equipment to spy or cause some kind of technological mischief. Huawei says that it is owned almost entirely by its employees, that it doesn't and would not take orders from the Chinese government, that its equipment cannot be used for spying, and that there have never been any actual cases in which it has used its equipment dishonestly. That last part is undoubtedly true. But as we discussed in episode 114, some countries do accept Huawei at its word. Others, such as the US and Australia, do not. And still other countries, such as the UK, partially accept it, but subject Huawei to their own security tests. So these two distinct but related storylines, the trade negotiations between the US and China and the national security concerns about Huawei, these both converged on the national security order against Huawei. What does this mean for consumers? A couple of things. First, Google cut off support with Huawei, which will affect Android users. But more importantly, Huawei needs American companies to supply parts for its phones, and that could be the larger hurdle to overcome. It seems that Huawei was prepared to a certain extent for this moment. They rely on US-made chips, processors, storage, and networking components. But the company said it has been stockpiling these US-made parts for a while. They have supplies that can last between 3 months and a year of handset production. As far as Android goes, Huawei itself will continue to support the Android operating system on phones that they have sold, and they can continue to use the open source Android software. That is free and open to anyone. But Google won't be able to provide technical support, security updates, and help with Google applications. So as a backup measure, Huawei says it has been developing its own operating system in case it needs it. A lot of you have been asking what I think about what's going on. And I think what we're seeing is the beginning of a great power rivalry. Perhaps not even the beginning. Perhaps we are seeing a great power rivalry maturing. We haven't really seen a rivalry between two world powers since the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. In this case, the two sides are trying to send a message to one another with their actions. The US is trying to send the message that it is the biggest economy and the biggest economic power in the world, and that with a few executive orders, it can cause companies to move their factories out of China and take their business elsewhere. China wants to demonstrate that they may once have been all about low-cost manufacturing, but they're now integral to the world economy, producing high-value products and services that are used all over the world. And that they're also sitting on a lot of the rare earth metals that everyone needs to produce their technologies. So we'll see how all this plays out. Both sides probably have an incentive to take some big actions, but then back off a little later. We'll see. A bunch of you suggested this topic. JR suggested it to me first, but also thanks to Song, Jorge, Michelle, Maria Paola for all contributing their thoughts. I mentioned a few weeks ago that we're going to be dedicating a little more time to social media, so I wanted to let you know we're posting more, and you're more than welcome to, obviously share our posts with your friends, but also send us messages on there. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we are Plain English Pod, and WeChat, we are Plain English Podcast. And I promised the WhatsApp number earlier. You can send a WhatsApp message to me at +1 312 967 8757. So I told you that I had to read some books in English since I just read that one in Spanish. And let me tell you which ones I read on my vacation. First up was The Tattooist of Auschwitz. I read that one in less than 24 hours. It's a great story of love and survival during the Holocaust. It's based on the recollection of one survivor as told to an Australian author. And it's available in multiple languages, including Spanish and Portuguese. It's also available as an audiobook in English. I think this is one that some of you might like to listen to or even try reading in English. And remember, you can get a free audiobook from Audible by visiting plainenglish.com/book, B-O-O-K. The other book I read was called Freedom by Jonathan Franzen. I just loved sitting out by the pool or on the porch, listening to the ocean and reading into the night, getting lost in a book. It's one of my favorite things to do on vacation. But we're back at work now, and that means we have an expression to review today, and that is to flare up. That is a phrasal verb. Here's how you first heard it. The US and China have been in trade negotiations for about a year, but a conflict flared up between the two sides, and that resulted in each country putting tariffs on some of the other's products. The conflict flared up between them. There's a pretty good image that you can use to remember this. A flare is like a flame of fire. So picture a slow-burning fire, and then all of a sudden a big flame shoots up. That's like when something flares up. So the US and China have been in these negotiations for a while. Negotiations are tough. There are two sides. And it's not like the negotiations have been intense for a few years. There are ups and downs. But a conflict flared up. A conflict quickly developed. So you'll use flare up to describe when some type of conflict, anger, pain, or danger suddenly appears. Let me give you a couple more examples. I had a slight headache all day, but for some reason, right before bed, the pain just flared up and I couldn't fall asleep. In this example, you had a little bit of dull pain, and that's fine, we can live with that. But when it flares up, when it suddenly becomes more intense, ouch, that's when it gets really bad. So pain can flare up. Anything that's normally low intensity that becomes high intensity pain, that's when it flares up. Cancer or an illness can flare up. There are times where doctors think they have everything under control, but for some unknown reason, the symptoms flare up again. They get more intense. It doesn't have to be pain. It could be the size of a tumor. It could be arthritis. Even a rash on your skin can flare up. Sometimes just being under a lot of stress can cause your symptoms to flare up. If you get seasonal allergies, the change in temperature or a change in pollen levels could cause your allergies to flare up. It's common to say that violence sometimes flares up. Political protests or actions by the police or the government can cause violence to flare up. I think you get the idea. It's not a really common phrasal verb, but you do see it every now and then, so now you know what it means and how to use it. It's Thursday, so JR has a listener-suggested song to share with the audience. It's a good classic song this week. I've Got You Under My Skin by Frank Sinatra. And we have to thank Rodolfo from Ecuador for this suggestion. The title is a bit of a play on words, since if something gets under your skin, it bothers you. But in this case, it's kind of like a romantic tribute. Frank Sinatra has a great voice, and he would be a fine addition to any English playlist. He was one of the most popular musicians in the US in the 1940s and 1950s. My personal favorite Sinatra song is New York, New York, which they play at the end of every Yankees home game. But I've Got You Under My Skin by Frank Sinatra is a good one too, and that is today's song and this week's Song of the Week. And thanks to JR for selecting the song and to Rodolfo for nominating it. If you would like to contribute a song to the show, please send your nomination to JR by email. His email address is jr@plainenglish.com. Great to be back home and with you once more. It's nice to have my voice back too. That's important for someone who records his voice every week. I think I just needed some vitamin D. What do you think? I spent some time working on the podcast, like I mentioned, and on the great plans I have for the future while I was there. And I'm back and more excited than ever to be with you each and every Monday and Thursday. Remember that JR and I offer a whole lot more than just the show. We have transcripts on the website, and we send out additional English resources by email. So if you'd like to build even more vocabulary, read more about the topics we choose, all for free, by the way, then you won't want to miss out on the email resources we offer. Just visit plainenglish.com/mail, M-A-I-L, and you can begin boosting your vocabulary with 2 additional words each week. That's all for today. JR and I will be back on Monday. If you've ever opened your closet and said, "I have nothing to wear," then you will want to hear Monday's episode. That's all I'm saying. Until then, have a great weekend, study hard, and thanks for being part of the best audience in the world. If you enjoy listening to Plain English, then I'd like you to consider joining Plain English Plus. With video lessons, faster audio, flashcards, and online courses, it's the best way to take your English to the next level. Visit plainenglish.com/plus to read all about it.